Hi, my name's Dan, and this video is one in a series of videos that I'm doing on the design of magic systems for video games, which is part of a larger suite of videos about games design issues and designing particular mechanics. And in this video, I'm going to be focusing in on the actual gameplay mechanics in a very low-level sense of casting spells inside your magic system. Some of this is going to be stating the very clearly obvious stuff, but I do quite like to do that. So we're dealing with spell mechanics, and this gives me an opportunity to use my pathetic and slightly time-consuming joke. Here we go. MECHANICS. That's how you spell mechanics. Right, moving swiftly on. So the first thing I want to talk about is the use of a resource for magic. It's pretty common for them to be some kind of limited resource in games that you use when you're casting spells in order to limit your ability to spam spells over and over again. You can do that with timing and cooldown, and we'll talk about timing in a minute or two. But it's fairly common to use something like mana as a resource. Here's a picture of a mana bar from Skyrim down at the bottom left there. Everybody who plays video games at any depth or length knows that mana is blue and health is red. Sometimes health is green, but mana is always blue. Who came up with that in the first place? I don't know. It's one of those things that's just an accepted norm. So it doesn't have to be mana. It could be some kind of action point system. It could be called magic points. It could be called all sorts of different things. But essentially, it is a resource that you are using when you're casting spells. So there are questions about this. So the first question maybe to ask is, if you're not calling it mana, you're calling it something like action points, does that mean it's part of a wider system that uses action points, so that not everything that uses an action point might be something that's called a spell or called something magical? So a good example of this would be combat abilities like a shield bash or something like that. If that costs action points too, then you'll basically be aware that you're using the same mechanic for magical and non-magical things. And that's fine. Plenty of games do that, but as a designer, you just need to be aware of what you're doing and be kind of in control of those decisions. Then there are always questions with resources like this. So there are questions about how much do you have, how do you increase how much you have, potentially over time, or if you got an RPG, if you're leveling up. How much does a spell cost to cast? So what's the casting cost? What happens when you run out of mana? And the normal reaction to that is to say, well, you can't actually cast the spell then. Does it regenerate over time? And if so, how fast? And or are there other ways of regenerating it? And if there aren't any other ways of regenerating it, you've got a broken game because you're only able to cast spells until your mana runs out, and then you're not able to cast spells for the rest of the game unless you've got some way of regaining them. Okay, so moving on. So I promised we're going to talk about time elements, and there are two elements of time to do with casting spells. So the first is the casting time. So how long it takes from when the player initiates whatever they need to do to cast the spell, maybe clicking on a button, till when the spell actually has finished casting. So it could be instants. A lot of games do that, and you don't have to have the same strategy for all spells within your game. You can vary these things. It could take a time to cast. So obvious thing with the time to cast is that means that instantly that gives you a an ability to stop the player from just going cast, 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 and spamming the spell, because if it takes time to cast, then they can do them back to back, but it can only happen so often. There's another thing that can happen potentially if they're casting, if the player's casting, are they interruptible? So if their opponent does something, hit them, for example, can that stop their spell casting from happening? And I've also seen it in games that instead of actually cancelling the casting, it knocks back the timer. So if you've got a timer going through in casting, so it'll take them longer to cast. And the justification for that is that if you're being hit, then obviously it's a distracting thing and you can't concentrate on your casting. And then the next question really is that the other side of it is the lasting time. So I quite like the fact that these two very similar in name, casting time and lasting time. How long does the spell actually last for? So is it instant? Does it happen, bam, and then it's done? I guess it'd be possible for that to happen at a delayed point after the casting. I can't think off the top of my head of any spells in any games that do this. It might be an interesting mechanic. I suggest you don't want to do things that are delayed by several minutes, but a few seconds. I guess I wonder if there's interesting ways that could be used as a mechanic. And then some spells have a duration, so damage over time, any kind of buffs. And I guess there's also, we talked about different kinds of spells in the previous video. If you're doing an enchantment on something, that might be permanent. So your duration could be permanent. And then similarly to interruptible casting, is your lasting, your spell when it's taking effect, is it banishable in some way? So is there some way that the opponent can get rid of it? For example, if it's a curse on them. So that's tying them in place, for example, they might be able to do something that interrupts that and gets rid of it. Okay, so the next thing, which is kind of really the third main mechanic for spellcasting, is to talk about components. So I've got a nice picture here from one of the Sims expansions, which actually shows several of the things I'm going to talk about. So the first one is spoken words. Conceptually, sometimes spells, you need to say something, or the player character is to say something. It's usually not the player who has to say something. I guess that would be interesting. And the question is, or a question is, if they have to be able to speak to be able to cast, are they unable to cast if they're muted? Similarly, there may be gestures. This could cause all sorts of interesting moves whilst your mage is casting spells. And a similar question is, are they unable to cast these spells if they're bound, if they're tied up in some way so they can't move their arms around? They may have held equipment. So, for example, things like wands or magic amulets or something like that enable them to cast the spells. There could be static equipment or locations. Example I've got here is a cauldron. So a cauldron might be kind of semi-movable, or you might need a fire to cast your spell, but you might also have the ability to create a fire. Or it may be that your static equipment is something that the player cannot have any control over, and so just exists at specific points in the world. World of Warcraft used to have a thing called a mana loom for you to be able to do certain kinds of magic tailoring. Or it could be a location, so it could be in a temple or in woods or on a mountaintop or anything that can be specified like that. And then finally, you might have consumed items, which might be what you would have thought of instantly when I said components. So that could be things like rat's blood, and leg of toad, and eye of PE teacher, or whatever it is that you want to throw in there. Okay, so really that's the main mechanics. I just want to talk also about an extra mechanic, which is the idea of scrolls. here's a picture of a scroll. It doesn't have to be a scroll. There are other kinds of artifacts that can have the same kind of effect, which is to store a spell for later use. However, scrolls are a fairly common way of doing this. So the point is that they capture a spell, and they're usually created by a mage. Although your magic system in your game could actually all be done through scrolls, and you buy the scrolls from vendors or get them as drops and pickups, etc. So you could say the only way of actually having a spell go live in the world is for it to be first captured in a scroll and then released from some kind of casting. It's often these things are usable by non-mages, and this is quite a strong mechanic in that sense. And so I guess it's something to be careful of in terms of overpowering other types of classes and players. And they're usually either a one-shot or limited use item for practical gameplay reasons, which is if you have the ability to store a spell in a scroll and repeat it infinitely, then basically you're turning every kind of class in your game into a magic user, because they can do that. Okay, so that's the nitty-gritty of a whole lot of stuff about casting of spells. So again, I will say that I realise that quite a bit of this is stating things that are totally obvious to people who play games a lot. But what I want to do through this is to present you with potential options and ways to think about how you design the mechanics for your own spell systems, your own magic systems. Remember that you don't necessarily, even if your magic system itself might have a good unified feel and be explained, it doesn't mean that you need to use exactly the same mechanic for every spell. And in fact, it's quite good to have variety, because that then brings in some of the tactical elements, particularly in combat. If you've got time to cast, then a spell that takes time to cast and is potentially interruptible has a risk involved in it. Whereas an instant spell doesn't, and so you might be choosing between a lesser spell and a greater spell, but you've got some risk there. Anyway, that's me talking, which is mostly what my videos are about, so I'm going to say that's it from me for now.